So thank you for having me. First of all, I have to give a little bit of a warning. This might be preaching to the choir a bit, but the choir needs attention sometimes too. When you're struggling to defend something important or you're in a bit of a battle, sometimes we use battle analogies here. The troops need some reminder of what they're up to. And so, preaching to the choir. The talk is on liberal education, and in the talk I basically equate liberal education with a philosophical education. That is to say, like, you see sights and you hear sounds, right? There's this kind of definitional there. You see sights, you hear sounds. Liberal education teaches philosophical activity, and I know that there are some people in other disciplines who might be bothered by this, but this is my apology. So these are the parts of the talk. I focus on Socrates up front and then talk about a pedagogical problem with teaching Socratically, and then how the same pedagogical problem appears when you're dealing with colleagues from other disciplines. And then I turn to talk a little bit about the nature of philosophy and how it has to be disguised in today's academy, and finally how oddly it fits into today's campus culture. Now I'm not sure to what extent my complaints here, it's kind of a curmudgeonly talk, I'm not sure the extent to which my complaints here would apply or would not apply to Christendom and the type of education offered here. And so put that as a question, right? So it's going to apply differently here than it would, for example, at UMass Amherst, right? But then the question is, does it still apply? So liberal educators today face a problem, both perennial and particular, and in this, our patron, Socrates, provides a model for us. Socrates' rhetorical situation is impossible. He has landed in front of the jury because he has said some things some important citizens find insulting. He also says things many members of the jury would naturally find insulting. Some think Socrates wanted to be convicted, that he had gone out of his way to insult certain citizens and then did the same to the jury when faced with an avoidable death. Socrates regularly conversed with citizens respected, especially by themselves, as knowers and doers, in order to expose their failure to understand themselves as not understanding crucial things. Socrates claims some type of expertise in education, and he accuses members of the jury of being cowardly, unmanly, when faced with bodily or political dangers, or when faced with the moral and intellectual danger of error. Was Socrates right to say things people found insulting? There are two standards of correctness here. Were the offending statements true? And was the saying of them prudent? That is, and we have to remember this when we feel insulted, feeling offended is neither a valid objection to the truth of a claim nor a decisive objection to the prudence of an utterance. Some statements are insulting, true, and good to say. Let's move this issue to the back burner. Another question is how we read Socrates' irony. A quick phenomenological point, that our assumptions and our attitudes always color the way things appear to us, right? So the perceptions are colored by our attitudes. The cynical attitude of the reader of Socrates images Socrates as arrogant, believing he has answered the questions he raises with others. The generous attitude imagines Socrates as truthful in his denial that he knows the answers. Interlocutors and readers take on such attitudes. These interpretations get complicated by whether the interlocutor or reader thinks he himself already knows these answers adequately. For example, the hagiographic attitude is held by someone aware of the inadequacy of his own guesses and who imagines Socrates as really knowing the answers while denying he does. And then Socrates becomes some kind of oracle, right? You think he has the answers and you want him to tell you. Though I don't have the space to defend this view, I will plant my flag here. Socrates knows he doesn't adequately know the answers. Further, I know I don't either, though I know I often assume I do. So I would defend the non-cynical, non-hagiographic interpretation of Socrates, and I aspire to more honesty with myself about what I don't know. To a person who imagines he knows these answers adequately, Socratic activity naturally appears offensive. Why? Well, persistent questioning implies inadequacy of supplied answers. To a person who thinks no one can really answer in better or worse ways, Socratic dedicated wonderment appears foolish. To those of us committed vocationally to drawing people into Socratic activity, and this happens not only in those too few philosophy classes worth the name, but also in many literature, politics, theology, and classic text classrooms, these facts about Socrates' rhetorical situation are pedagogically crucial. Many students simultaneously assume both that they already answer adequately Socrates' questions, and also that no one can. That puts them at once in both categories of people disposed not to like Socrates. As teachers inspired by Socrates, we aim to help students discuss and clarify questions that are simultaneously of both universal and personal significance, and that force people into self-reflection by spotlighting the fundamental assumptions undergirding all other claims, goals, and activities. For example, what does a successful human life look like? How can what we are told about ourselves from biology and religion cohere? How should a human being and a citizen be educated? Every adult has opinions about such matters, but it is difficult for minds untouched by philosophical practice to engage such questions with balance. They haven't gained their sea legs. Our vocation is to apprentice students in the activity of appreciating and discussing such questions so that they are better able to see and respond to the world. When we teach, we are colored by the attitudes that color Socrates. Some students imagine us as possessing the answers, yet we coyly refuse to hand our possession over. This may arouse student annoyance or adulation. Or they may imagine us as not knowing the answers, and thus to be running a course where no knowledge is taught, wasting their time and grading them unjustly. To evade this appearance problem, we can sell our courses as a type of philodoxy. Instead of philosophy, love of wisdom, it's love of opinion. With irony, that is, pretending philosophy is something less than it is, we may say we are teaching the variety of positions on such issues. I've said that before. Or we may justify our courses as intellectual history or cultural self-archaeology. I've said those things before. By doing so, the teacher risks hollowing out himself and philosophy, betraying his and its substance. One cannot defend philosophy in unphilosophical terms without presenting it as something it is not. With those students who need external incentives, whose philosophical eros is not already heated up, one must buy time while luring the person into tasting the essential purpose. These strategies, appealing to incidental benefits of our courses, seem kosher, but only insofar as they subserve rather than supplant the goal of apprenticing Socratic activity. Without pretending to be more than we are, we must hold out the hope that our courses will help them better understand such questions. To pry open students' souls to Socratic activity, we must at once undermine the dogmatic and skeptical assumptions, both the assumption that we already know and the assumption that no one can. This involves appealing to their imaginations without peddling false images. We want them to acquire the crucial habit of imagining themselves as wrong, while also stoking their imagination that something better might be found, knowledge-wise. Now, these same assumptions that make difficult the teaching of philosophy conspire to make difficult any defense of it to people who, like Socrates' craftsmen, know quite a lot about other things without practice in Socratic self-examination in search of wisdom. That includes most academics. Has everyone read the Apology of Socrates? So the three groups, the politicians, the poets, and the craftsmen, I think today's academics are most like the craftsmen. Those who found Socrates' activity insulting were proud of their knowledge and accomplishments. They disdained him for lacking what they hung their pride on. This disdain became indignation when Socrates claimed a good they did not possess. Such a situation must turn dangerous when goods like honor, power, or curricular requirements are at stake. Students have less disdain for, students probably don't know this, but in colleges, when the school decides to revamp its requirements, all hell breaks loose. It's a contact sport. Students have less disdain for and feel less threat, and the reason for that is because, and they don't know this. They don't know this is why it becomes a contact sport so fast. It's not. Everyone thinks it's turf, and they think it's like an economic thing. That what you're doing is rent seeking. That you're trying to get like more students in your seats and more money, and therefore another seat in your department. There's truly an economic angle to it. But more deeply, the reason it becomes a contact sport so fast is because the real question is, what does it mean to live a good life? and every department thinks that it makes the crucial contribution to that. Students have less disdain for and feel less threatened by, and are thus less threatening to, philosophy's questioning, because they are less sure of their own wisdom than are most academics. To many, Socrates' professed ignorance appeared and appears still ironic, a tricky boastfulness. Even, or especially, when denying their own wisdom, philosophy teachers often seem arrogant to their colleagues. Are they? Let's think about the phenomenon of arrogance for a moment. So again, it's important to remember here that your attitudes and your opinions color the way things appear to you. And I'm taking for granted a kind of Aristotelian system in which there's a virtue, which would be something like proper self-esteem, where you accurately identify your own strengths and weaknesses, and then there would be two vices flanking that virtue. So there'd be a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. And there's the humble person on the one side who thinks too little of themselves, and then there's the arrogant person on the other side who thinks too much of themselves. So it is easier to appear arrogant in your comportment to an arrogant person than to someone lacking self-esteem. So if you're talking to two people at a party and you're the person with proper self-esteem, and you can talk to two people, one's a humble person and one's an arrogant person, you're not going to seem arrogant to the humble person, because they're going to think you're awesome because they don't think much of themselves, right? You're going to seem arrogant to the arrogant person. This appearance results only partly from your attitude toward him. It results also from his prior images of you and of himself. Arrogance results from the belief one possesses an excellence one does not. The arrogant person is arrogant toward those he disdains for lacking the goods grounding his pride. Naturally, persons with proper self-esteem will often appear arrogant to an arrogant person. The arrogant person who grows vulnerable, glimpsing his possible failure to possess the good grounding his pride, will easily feel offended when a disdained person occasions this glimpse of himself. Perhaps philosophy teachers are typically, maybe even essentially, arrogant. But maybe this appearance arises rather from a prior disdain some others have for us and our activity. So, first hypothesis, to explain the common accusation of arrogance against philosophy teachers by other academics, is that it is the accuser's arrogance that causes a false appearance. Another hypothesis, philosophy teachers appear arrogant because philosophy's task is impossibly ambitious for human beings. And to take it up suggests one esteems oneself capable of it. Two facts of academic life magnify this appearance of arrogance. The first fact, today's academy assumes disciplinary and professional equality. Flattering this fiction is called collegiality. Second fact, most academics are, both in reality and in their self-images, no less than professional philosophers, not only credentialed and accomplished, but serious persons, dedicated professionals, and really very smart. A defense of Socratic activity in the academy founders on the first fact, the assumption of equality. Those academics who require a defense of philosophy are usually not inwardly familiar with it, so descriptions might be called for, but they aren't going to like the descriptions offered. We may say philosophy asks the most fundamental questions, reflects on the deepest assumptions, is a meta-discipline interested in the whole and not defined by a narrow subject matter. It clarifies concepts, for example, those used in the other disciplines. It seeks to ground knowledge, for example, the knowledge claimed by other disciplines. It reflects on the whole of human experience. All of this offends, given the assumption of disciplinary equality. And if we call that assumption into question, philosophy will naturally appear unequal. That is, it will appear inferior to the other disciplines. Why? This is because a description of philosophy gives credentialed knowers reason to doubt that philosophy teachers know anything at all. What is its methodology? Philosophy admits it doesn't have one the way the other disciplines do. It just strives to take nothing for granted and to think really hard about how things must be. More insults, right? Because that means they don't think really hard. They're taking things for granted. What is its subject matter? Philosophy doesn't limit itself to a specific domain of the world. Because it implies that the disciplines are not self-sufficient in their methodologies or isolated in their subject matters, it hardly helps to add that all disciplines lead into Socratic activity. In our academy, philosophy must appear as another discipline. Yet philosophy defies the way that the disciplines are defined, and unless philosophy teachers cave, as most do, to identifying themselves by their subfields, for me, I'm a Husserlian social ontologist. Unless they do that, they seem to be experts in nothing in particular. As should be obvious, I have no discipline. Witness the scandal of philosophy, philosophers' failure to agree on anything. And then philosophy teachers might add the Socratic disclaimer that they cannot answer the questions they raise with others. They lack the type of answer that would eliminate the need to re-ask the question again soon. From their defense speeches, philosophy teachers will likely appear both as arrogant and as having nothing to teach. A defense of philosophy in the academy founders also on the second fact above, that most academics are serious persons, dedicated professionals, and really very smart. Describing philosophy requires offering examples of our questions. For example, what is truth? What is human success? What's the good of knowledge? Many will at first think neither they nor their disciplines need help with these questions. This is natural because all disciplines do lend light on them. But by definition, no partial discipline can sufficiently address them. So if this is the response, the examples of philosophical questions will have failed to jolt the interlocutor into the Socratic attitude. Successfully raising these questions with people who have dedicated their lives to other questions reminds them that they have not dedicated much time to these questions. There is always something ad hominem in philosophy, because we are always at issue. Its questions challenge who we are, our place in the whole, what we think we know, and what we think is important. So philosophy is always a little personally unsettling. Thus, success here may be worse than failure. Questions chosen strategically to illustrate the need for philosophy, if successful, remind other academics that they lack something that directly touches on them as professionals, as expert knowers, and as human beings. The more important the question, the more cutting the lack. The more the defense succeeds in principle, the more we fail personally. In sum, on top of the human disposition to imagine oneself as already answering philosophy's questions, academics will likely think that their disciplines, toward which they feel a professional patriotism, already address them. And on top of the modern disposition to think that these questions cannot be answered in better or worse ways, academics have sophisticated standards for research methods and results, next to which Socratic searching clearly falls short. And then there's the fact that many philosophy teachers, with their heads in the clouds, don't care or care to know what many others take as obvious and important. For example, I know that there is this group of people called the Kardashians, and another called the Diggers, or something like that. I have no idea who they are, and I don't want to know. Like, you just see these things, and they kind of surface in culture. I don't care. I don't know. Why do people think they're important? Thus, Socrates presents the stereotype in the Theaetetus, quote, "The philosopher is the object of general derision, partly for what men take to be his superior manner, and partly for his constant ignorance and lack of resources in dealing with the obvious." Given all this, not only will the jurymen probably think, I already addressed these questions, and no one can really answer these questions, they will likely also think, philosophers sure as heck don't answer them. And about this, of course, they're right. If philosophy teachers often appear arrogant to their colleagues, it's an open question whether they or their colleagues are more responsible for this appearance. Certainly blame varies case by case. But this appearance seems sometimes inevitable if we present our job not ironically, but as what it is. That is because, and this only sounds arrogant, philosophical questions are more fundamental and ultimate than the questions driving other disciplines. That is also because, and this only sounds humble, we are arrogant, as are all human beings, by imagining ourselves as understanding things we do not. How could we be faithful to Socrates and deny that? Inherent to philosophy are two features at war with each other. First, the attempt at omniscience, knowing the whole. And second, the the need never to forget the inquirer, to know oneself as human and possessing only human wisdom. Here's Robert Sokolowski on the paradoxical human attempt at knowing the whole. Quote, this is a slightly longer quote. The philosopher is omniscient only formally and in principle, that is, only potentially. People sometimes complain that a philosopher pretends to be a know-it-all and that he tries to tell everybody else what they're doing. But the complaint is unjustified. It is true that if someone presents himself as a philosopher, he will not be able to recuse himself from any philosophical question. He is called in his profession to address the whole of things. But the potential omniscience of the philosopher is chastening because, like Socrates, he's always aware that he does not know but is obliged to know. Unquote. And just to elaborate on that, like if I'm teaching a metaphysics course and someone starts asking the how do you know question, I'm not allowed to say that belongs in an epistemology class. Right? I'm required to address it. I know it's part of what I'm doing. Whereas other people have much more neatly defined fields. I try to get my students occasionally, there's a math professor I'm friends with, and I tried to get one to, in her class, just raise the question, she's teaching calculus or something, and I want her to raise her hand and say, what is number? What is number? And the mathematician has no obligation to answer that. As a mathematician, she doesn't claim to know. And that's kind of interesting, isn't it? So this human-superhuman tension is built into our activity. Thus, in the Consolation of Philosophy, has anyone read the Consolation? Thus, in the Consolation of Philosophy, when Lady Philosophy appears in Boethius' cell, her eyes have, quote, a more than human keenness, unquote. And although she seems sometimes of averagely human height, at other times she seems, quote, to pierce the very heavens and baffle the eyes that look upon her, unquote. Likewise, Husserl insists that, quote, we must distinguish between philosophy as an historical fact at a given time and philosophy as idea, as infinite task to which we are called, unquote. This is an idea we cannot let go of, yet one we know as impossibly beyond us. Here's Thomas Pruffer's version, again a slightly longer quote. Philosophy, perhaps more than any other human endeavor, is shadowed by the temptation to give itself up. And this is because the gap between its intention and achievement is so great. The infinite and accurate statement of being is never actual, hence the temptation to unarm the philosophical eros. The philosophical life is the erotic life, par excellence, and eros neither achieves plenty nor is satisfied in poverty. From the point of view of ordinary life and of the arts and sciences, a point of view from which more can be achieved because less is intended, philosophy often seems presumptuous nonsense. And philosophy's preoccupation with reflection on its own act usually leads to oscillation between confessing its failures and renewing its pretensions, unquote. The particular danger today, the way philosophy is now tempted to give itself up, to escape from this oscillation between, in Hume's words, philosophical melancholy and delirium, unquote, is by making itself just another one of the disciplines, another branch of partial expert knowledge, rather than a reflection on the whole of being in its human engagement. This is now our temptation and danger because it is also our disguise. In the Crito, the laws of Athens gently mock Socrates. In order to escape prison and death, he would need to disguise himself. In the Sophist, Plato suggests that the philosopher naturally misappears either as a sophist, a madman, or a statesman. If we must misappear, perhaps of these three we should choose the statesman. We are not inventing a disguise, yet being cloaked in one seems inevitable. We should use whichever one is given to us that permits us to do our work well. Today's academy robes us with a fourth possible misappearance: the researcher, the expert partial knower. We must take on this costume even within professional philosophy departments. And many philosophy teachers have taken cover as experts in literature, political science, or theology. A colleague once explained to me that he wants his students to understand how their professors ended up as they are. And this was his image. As a student, each one of us professors got fascinated by some particular thing and started digging, only to discover himself years later at the bottom of a hole, needing to remind himself what he was after in the first place. Whatever it is that I do, I appeared to my friend as like himself, having followed, self-forgetfully, chance inclinations to the bottom of a hole. In fact, the philosophical trajectory is in the other direction. It's outward. So a different hole might make a better image, the kind with a W in it. Having started with the desire fully to understand, Having started with a desire fully to understand some particular thing, we take a step back for more context, and again, until we find ourselves in space. Socratic activity just doesn't fit into the university as a collection of specializations. That isn't because there isn't some kind of expertise in philosophy. There is. Rather, our model today assumes that all expertise is radically partial. This is Weber's description in Science as a Vocation. Has anyone read Science as a Vocation? This is something everyone should read. The first half, you might get bogged down. The second half, I think you'll connect with better. After dismissing interdisciplinary work as superficial and prelude to science, Weber says, quote, a really definitive and good accomplishment is today always a specialized accomplishment. And whoever lacks the capacity to put on blinders in risking the fate of his soul on a narrow question may as well stay away from science, unquote. A new subspecialization is discovered every few months. So Weber's house has many rooms, but none has been prepared for us. The Weberian divide and conquer directive leaves no playful open spaces for our attempt at the whole and the human place in it. The regime of specialized sciences promises to master each part, but toward the whole, Weber suggests, we can have only subjectively chosen worldviews. I hate worldviews. Whenever anyone starts talking about worldviews, like all the hairs stand up. All philosophy can do, according to Weber, is discuss the consistency within worldviews. That is, a philosopher is an expert in worldviews of other people, and he can try to help people make their worldviews consistent. That's what philosophy would do here. And worldviews are something like an arbitrarily adopted personal religion, providing a person with a sense of ultimate meaning. This model of science is, for Weber, part of the modern rationalization of the world, a project of disenchantment. Quote, one can, in principle, master all things by calculation, unquote. But the all things here that we are trying to master piece by piece is not the same as the whole. Can we master the all, rather than merely all things, by this method? Though philosophy faces the whole, it makes no sense to do so in the way a specialized science seeks to master its region. The ultimate worldview Weber adopts is of a multiplicity of worldviews warring like pantheism's gods. You just choose your favorite god. You choose your favorite worldview. And that's his worldview. That is where the process of disenchantment must stop short for him. As a specialist, the philosopher is here a scientist of warring worldviews, or worse, a spinner of one, which seems to me not an academic project. It's easy to be cranky. Now, I'm not sure how well this applies to Christendom, but this is what's going on in the rest of the country. It's easy to be cranky about the new problems threatening the academy. The reductive short-sightedness of assessment with its positivistic assumptions. Do you all know what assessment is? It's woefully innocent. Assessment is these kind of, they're like multinational organizations. These weird organizations that have some kind of charter, usually from the federal government. They have some kind of authority that's quasi-legal. Then go to individual schools and say that we have to do assessment to prove that our students are learning. And so what we have to do is find a way to quantify how much you're learning. And that becomes the rubric according to which we're supposed to guide ourselves in the future. That's what assessment is. The reductive short-sightedness of assessment with its positivistic assumptions, the proliferation of legalistic administrative oversight, and the transformation of campuses into country clubs, complete with jugglers, comedians, and shuffleboard tournaments, designed to distract our students not only from distraction, but also from taking books too seriously. Now, without indulging these workaday laments, note that they seem a natural result of our Weberian self-image. The academy is one among all things. So the process of rationalization demands a disenchantment of the academy, which must be mastered by an expertise, administration. And part of living in a world of warring worldviews, ultimate and arbitrary, individually chosen values, which our sciences themselves say are not open to reasonable adjudication, part of living in that world is that we must cater to those values arbitrarily chosen by our customers. If committed to this model, academics cannot say to administrators that there is something about education that cannot be mastered by another specialization. Why would our specializations be valid and not the administrators? And if committed to this model, we cannot say to our students that education serves true goods that may not already be part of their value set. Why would our arbitrary value-drenched worldviews be worth their money? To challenge these forces of administration and consumerism, we should emphasize that the academy, in addition to selling content and skills, which is like a catchphrase, content and skills, that's what we teach, content and skills, is where citizens apprentice approaching the whole of life intellectually and remaining open to meanings and goods in the world beyond their current views. Our public culture doesn't know it needs this, but a Socratic classroom is a wildlife sanctuary for the free human intellect. It's a nature preserve for natures capable of liberty and truth. In place of skepticism and dogmatism, we foster Socrates' erotic humility and courage. It may look like wasted, untilled land to others, but it protects the person and leavens our culture. If we abandon this vocation, invite the hall monitors of outcomes assessment into our classrooms, and to student life, bring in the clowns. So here we are in the academy, at the bottom of various holes we dug ourselves. I didn't challenge my friend's image of me or himself. After all, mustn't Socratic teachers misappear this way to other academics? And shouldn't we sometimes use this misappearance? We must sometimes play the credentialed partial knower card, even though philosophy is really something that can never merely be left to the experts. Defending philosophical activity is impossible as the crow flies. And this is true with your aunt at Thanksgiving, right? And it's equally true with the biologist. And you'd think that it would be easier with another academic, but it's harder. This fact must inform our pedagogy as well as our self-presentation to colleagues. We lose if we lay our cards on the table without strategy, for it's high-stakes poker with friends who forget which hands trump others. To state the situation directly seems mean and is counterproductive, for it will not be understood. It is folly to defend Socrates in the academy without irony. On the other hand, some things, insulting or not, must be heard sometimes. For example, when others' ignorance or disdain for us threatens student access to Socratic courses. But unless we till the ground ahead of time, asserting Socrates' centrality to academics is usually imprudent. It will appear comically boastful. Must we not try gently, with circumspection and some irony, to engage others in the activity we love, seducing the eros for philosophy that subterraneously animates their specialized academic quests and even their personal lives? Philosophy teachers need the disguise of a discipline to survive in today's academy. Still, they should not confuse this shadow for themselves. In the long run, it is impossible to defend Socratic activity in the academy without trying to make the academy and ourselves more Socratic. And although this task may be impossibly ambitious for human beings, isn't endeavoring it part of our vocation? Or does prudence suggest sharing this activity only with the young? That's it.
of Cardinal Benjamin Newman's Heidegger University in his defense of theology as a discipline. Do you think that theology and philosophy and subjects stood together and fell together, or really defend theology?
Yeah, so I would want to defend the distinction between theology and philosophy as kind of disciplines in the academy, while insisting that something like this. Ask yourself the question, what's the difference between catechetics and theology? Any theologians in the room? What's the difference between catechetics and theology? I kind of, anyone, I mean, I have a way of saying this. I'd like to say that theology is catechetics grown up, or theology is catechetics with a Socratic attitude. I mean, you cannot do real theology unless you get a Socratic attitude going. And I'm sure we all know religious people who are incapable of really doing theology because they think in advance that they already have the answers. Or that they can, I had an argument with someone last year about hell. And I said something, she says, I don't think we're allowed to believe that. Yoink, off the shelf, opened up, read the catechism on hell. And the point is that it immediately shuts down any kind of conversation about what this idea is. Basically, I said, well, I'm not sure we have to believe in hell, because notice that the church names saints and not damned, right? We don't have any official, even Judas, we don't officially have a doctrine that Judas is in hell. And it's not heretical to say that no one's in hell. And so she started saying, well, according to the catechism, you're allowed to believe that no one is in hell, but you have to believe in hell. And I didn't push it, but the point is like, there's actually a really neat question there about what it would mean for hell to exist with it being empty. Is it that kind of place? Like Australia can exist without someone being there, right? But can hell exist without someone? But anyways, the point was that move, the taking the book off the shelf and opening it up, made this catechetics and not theology. And that's because the Socratic element was completely gone. And you can't really be a grown-up in the faith, I think, unless you have some Socrates in you. Is that good? Yes, sir.
You had a continuation in a different light of that question. In philosophy, what place is there for reliance on tradition and outside authority? And how can that be compatible with Socratic dialogue? Or is everything just a free fall?
So I'm not sure I get your question. Is there room for outside authority? How would that be in conflict with a Socratic dialogue?
I guess the question is, how can we then take into account those who have gone before us while still applying the Socratic method? At what point do tradition and exploration, how do they meet in the Socratic world?
Okay, I several things to say. First of all, the appeal to authority is a fallacy. Kind of. Like all formal, all fallacies that would be fallacies for deductive reasoning, often a bad deductive argument can be a strong inductive argument. That is to say, just because Thomas Aquinas believes something, that doesn't make it true, right? That's a fallacy. But the fact that, and then you can list like the 3,000 most smartest people to have ever existed believe something. That also doesn't make it true, but kind of makes it a good inductive argument that you better really think about that before you deny it. You see what I mean? And so philosophy refuses to take things on loan from other people's minds. It refuses just to say, I'm going to believe this because someone else believed that. Insofar as you're trying to do philosophy, you're not allowed to do that. On the other hand, it's always been part of philosophy that we recognize that other people's minds work too, and so that when other people believe something, we have a responsibility to take their belief of it as more evidence for it being true, even if it's not proof that it's true. And so this is just something you have to learn to deal with as a philosopher. In Aristotle, for example, he has this method called the dialectical method. He talks about this thing called the endoxa. The endoxa, often it's translated as reputed opinions or honored opinions. And these are things held by everybody, or most people, or the really wise people, and especially the wisest of the wise people. And what he always does is he starts his philosophical treatment by looking at those beliefs, the honored opinions, and he almost never ends up rejecting them. Almost never. There's always some way in which they turn out to be kind of true, even when he corrects them. And so that's a part of philosophy. I think modern philosophy emphasizes the individual mind so much that it becomes hard to see how a philosopher could ever value what another mind thinks. And so this tension becomes much more acute, I think, in modern philosophy. But the main thing in philosophy is not to discover something true. Let me emphasize it differently. The main thing is not to discover something true. The main thing is to discover something true, whether or not you were the one that first discovered it, right? And so, and if you get that up from someone else, so in fact, practically all of our knowledge of the world comes in this intersubjective way, this communal way in which we rely on each other's insights. Now, how does that fit with the Socratic dialogue? Well, I think that's part of the Socratic dialogue. You have people coming together to talk. And so the different question is, why do we still bother reading Socratic dialogues today? Doesn't that rely on history? Doesn't that imply that we think that there's some truth in history? And I think the main thing here is that reading a book is just like being in a dialogue. It's just that the person is dead, right? That there's a certain kind of one-way communication between the dead and the living in a written text, but in such a way that you become contemporaries with them, and you really are joining in a conversation with them. So it's not just honoring tradition, or it's not just honoring what other people have said in the past. That's not why we read old books. We read them because they're good, and because they become part of our contemporaries when we read them. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? I'm not sure I actually got it.
It does. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming and talking to us.
Thank you.
So, philosophy is very important, but other specialized fields like science and history, those are important too. So, do you have any advice for people that are working in those specialized fields? How do they apply philosophy to their life and focus on it while taking a specialized?
That's a very good question. And I think, the first thing to say, and I don't say this explicitly in the talk, is that obviously, the other disciplines do all kinds of neat things that philosophers can't do. And this is why it's not an insult when I try to say that academics are like the craftsmen rather than the poets and the politicians. Of the three groups, Socrates says about the craftsmen, they know many noble things that I do not know. He doesn't say that about the politicians or the poets. And to say to the biologists, it's obvious, they know many noble things that I do not know. But they also often seem to think that they know things that they don't actually know. And that's the mistake that Socrates is trying to get them to see. So how is it that you maintain that while in another field? Well, I think the first thing is there's nothing wrong with being more fascinated by a particular field than by questions of the whole. But you should maintain in the back of your mind that everything that you discover in this partial area that you're fascinated by is part of the whole, and therefore it has implications on the whole, and the whole has implications on it. So there's no sealed area there in which your field is going to be completely independent. And so you have to maintain an openness to that. Secondly, I would say that I think a really good deal of specialized workers in other fields are people who maintain a philosophical interest. The easiest example is Heisenberg, right? The physicist, who basically at some points, he's writing philosophy at some points, and he's a bit of Aristotelian, I think. I'm trying to remember what it is that I've read of him. I think it was his father. I can't remember. Does anyone know Heisenberg's biography well enough? Help me out. But this is just the example that comes to my mind. Do you know anything about Heisenberg?
No, that was a question.
So I think the people who are most able to see something new in these fields are often people who can keep the big questions alive and who can recognize how their particular problem relates to the big question. Here's one way to think about it. I have young children, and let's say my 6-year-old asks me a question, and I give her the answer, and she says, why? So she says, well, why does the patrol leader get to boss me around in the bus? And I say, well, because that's their job, or because they're older, or the bus driver needs help, right? And then she says, why? And then I answer that question. And then she says why to my answer. And I answer that question. You give me 3 or 4 whys, and it's a philosophical answer. It can no longer just be a factual answer. It has to be a philosophical answer. And that's true of every particular question. And so I think that in specialized disciplines, remembering how every question, if you ask why often enough, will lead back, I think that's one way to keep it alive in your head. Yes, ma'am?
In light of everything that you just said regarding that, this might be kind of a weird question, but is there anything that lies outside the realm of the obligation of the philosopher to know? I mean, if you think about it, I don't know, I guess if in some weird world we had eternal life and philosophers were continuously studying, would it be then the obligation of the philosopher to inform their mind with all those noble things that like biologists and chemists and whatever know?
Yeah, so one of the things Socrates says is that I'm obliged to be omniscient. I'm this seems like a correction, it's not. I'm not actually obliged, insofar as I'm trying to be a philosopher, to try to know everything. Namely, I don't need to know the facts. And that sounds really weird because our culture values facts so much. They think that everything comes down to facts. I hate facts. Facts are completely irrelevant to my job. And the philosopher is interested in how things must be. And so if you think of a fact as a contingent having been, right? There's the factum there. There's a contingency, and that's kind of locked in the past. That makes it a fact, right? None of that matters to philosophers. Philosophers are interested in how things must be, not in how they by chance have been or are. Now, the facts can be helpful to me in order to help me realize how things must be. So I think, well, things must be like this. And then I see a fact that contradicts it, and I'm like, oh, crap, right? And then I have to do better philosophy. But that's not because my obligation is to know the fact. I'm trying to figure out how things must be, and in order to be themselves. How things must be in order to be themselves. And the facts might be helpful there, but I don't have an obligation to know how to hang a window, or which would be really helpful to me right now. Or my friend's house was his attic was taken over by squirrels. He has no obligation to know that qua philosopher. Or anything that you're going to learn pretty much in your biology textbook or in your accounting textbook. Those aren't part of the realm of how things must be in order to be themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for coming.
In your talk, you said that a lot of times, I'll say an economist or some person in another field will get upset because, these things that philosophy deals with are so broad and moving in their field, like morals and the economy, for instance. So my question to you is, this is sort of relating back to your point when you say, well, someone like pulled out a catechism and now limited philosophy. So would you say then that there is a hierarchy of the sciences, though, and theology and certain truths that we have from Revelation would have to subdue philosophy? Because, I think that's sort of, we call philosophy the handmaiden of theology. So with that...
Do I look like a handmaiden?
Well, but this is just the sort of understanding that's come down to us through the great minds. So I wonder if you would see a place for that in the academy.
Okay, you get into pretty deep issues right away here about what theology is, faith-seeking understanding, right? What philosophy is, and is philosophy just pre-theology, as they call it in the seminary? See, I've got to take my pre-theology classes, those are philosophy classes. Is it just a tool in order to do theology better? I don't think so. In fact, I would try to make the opposite claim, which I already have, which is that in order to be theology, it has to be philosophical. It has to join the family there. In other words, theology is part of the human conversation. It is not a force outside of the human conversation that comes in and governs it and says, this is the truth, and then there's the human conversation going on down here, and somehow the truth from theology is going to limit it. I think that theology is a member of the human conversation, and at the highest level, that conversation is philosophical. But of course it's true, not just in the Catholic understanding, but certainly in the Catholic understanding, that there are certain truths of the faith that are not discoverable by natural reason. I mean, like the Trinity, like 3. Who guessed? I mean, it's not that arbitrary. I mean, in hindsight, there are stories you can say to make sense of the Trinity, but the point is that this is not something that natural reason could have discovered, I think. But that admission, I think, doesn't put theology above philosophy. Yeah. And I think it's very dangerous to the free human intellect, and also dangerous to the faith, to individuals sharing the faith, to the health of the church, etc. I think it's very dangerous to put theology as a kind of, how do we put this, external force that can come in and govern the proper human conversation. Then it becomes catechetics again, and because it's not true to the human intellect, it, I think, makes the church and the faith less human, right? So I really, really, really want to preserve the philosophical status of theology, rather than making philosophy a servant of theology. Yes, ma'am.
Would you say that skepticism is a necessary step at some point in the Socratic search for truth?
What do you mean by skepticism?
So questioning or doubting a truth or a principle?
Yeah, absolutely. So you could make the theological point here. Faith-seeking understanding, you can't do theology unless you realize you have to seek understanding. So if you think you know the answer already, then you can't do theology, right, according to the classic definition. In the Socratic sense, this is the whole point of the Elenchus, the Socratic refutation. So in the Meno, for example, have you read the Meno? Okay, in the Meno, the analogy there is that fish that paralyzes, right? So Socrates has different analogies for himself, different dialogues. People have different analogies for himself. And the idea is that the paradox there is that you cannot look for something unless you know that it's missing. So you have to know the thing. In order to try to learn something, you have to in some way know the thing that you don't know. You have to recognize yourself as not knowing something, and even that seems to be a form of knowledge. So there's a little paradox there. But the point is that to come to that realization about yourself that you don't know something or don't understand something is a necessary step to opening your mind to further reflection on it, or to learning about it, or discovery of it. So if that's what you mean by skepticism, that negative moment in which you say to yourself, I don't know, that is an essential prerequisite toward philosophy. And that's why Socrates insisted on it so much. Same with in the Sophist. This is another theme in the dialogue of the Sophist, right? And he, in the Sophist account, it's been 4 years since I read it, but my memory there is that he thinks, well, when you do this to somebody and you help them realize that they don't actually know something that they thought they knew, they'll thank you for it. And of course, there's a little irony there. That's what they should do, right? But that's not necessarily what they do, because there's something painful in it. So another one of his analogies is that he's a midwife. Like his mother was a midwife. He's not a statuary like his father. He's a midwife like his mother. And he's helping people get their ideas out. And that's a very painful process, especially, if the baby's ugly, it's not the midwife's fault, right? But he realizes there's a lot of pain there, and that he bears, it's easy to shoot the messenger. He bears a lot of the punishment when people get upset about that. But it's just something that's a necessary, painful process. Labor. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm curious to hear how you articulate this distinction, because I'm confident that we would agree that there is one. The difference between a Socratic approach of constant questioning and probing deeper, and a skeptical approach. So what makes Socratism a vocation versus skepticism?
Yeah, okay, so when you put it that way, skepticism is just a bigger word. So I would say that one of the things that skepticism is an essential part of Socratic philosophy, but it doesn't end there necessarily. If you say, well, Socratism, if I call this Socratism as a vocation, if I call it skepticism as a vocation, then I sound like just a total negative Nelly, right? To focus there would be always to say, you can't know, you can't know, you can't know. And there's a certain type of skepticism that will always end with that. You can't know, you can't know, you can't know. Whereas I think Socratic skepticism is always in the service of trying to further understanding, and you lose heart for that in certain types of skepticism. So the trick is it is very tricky. At one time, to try to get the person you're talking to, your student, your aunt, the biologist, right, to try to get them to realize that they don't really understand something that they think they understand, while at the same time trying to stoke their imaginations that they could still come to understand it better. Because one offshoot of the Socratic activity is just that negativeness. One of the things Socrates admits to in the Apology is that the children, the 20-year-old sons of the rich people in the city have been following him around, mimicking him. And you can imagine the way a 20-year-old would mimic the Socratic method. It's really easy to sit in the back of the classroom and go, how do you know? It's really easy to just try to sharpshoot other people's ideas. But the other side of the Socratic activity is a real eros to understand. And some skeptics, when they call themselves skeptics, or if you commit yourself to skepticism rather than Socratism, you leave out the eros for understanding.